The Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution for the United States. Now, first of all, we should all know that the Constitution created a more powerful general government than what we had under the Articles, what the founding generation referred to as a more high-toned system, or a government with more energy. But instead of covering those details of how they expanded power, on this episode, I'm going to discuss the underlying structure, the foundation that we never really learn about at all. So I'm going to outline 6 key differences between these two constitutions that demonstrate how the Articles of Confederation were much closer to a pure system of federalism than the Constitution. And when you go through this and you read anti-federalist papers and speeches, you'll more likely understand why, when they first read the Constitution, they thought of it as a national government rather than a republic. We're going to cover topics today like representation in Congress, the executive branch, the taxing power, the theft power, and more. The founding generation debated all of these, and it wasn't clear-cut whether the Federalist or anti-Federalist side thought one was awesome and one was not on each of these categories. And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts in the comments, which changes you think were good or bad for liberty. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024. And to kick it off, I want to start with James Madison, basically explaining to us why we actually need to study and understand the Articles of Confederation. I was never taught a thing about it in government-run schools other than, well, it was a failure, it didn't have enough power, and so therefore they needed more power. That's basically the only thing the government teaches us, is that government needed more power, and nothing else about the previous system could have been good whatsoever. So James Madison, writing in Federalist number 40, tells us, so you could even hate thinking about the Articles of Confederation and only want to understand the Constitution, but you still have to understand both. Otherwise, well, you're missing something important. Here's how Madison put it. He said, the truth is that the great principles of the Constitution proposed by the Convention may be considered less as absolutely new than as the expansion of principles which are found in the Articles of Confederation. So much of the Constitution was based on old principles, not brand new stuff, expansion of power. So if you want to understand how various powers were understood by the founders and the ratifiers, the people who gave the Constitution for the United States legal force, if you want to know the original legal meaning, you really got to go back to the Articles of Confederation, and much earlier as well. Now, Madison, in a letter of 1792 to Edmund Pendleton, he talked about the General Welfare Clause as an example of how this plays out in practice. And he said, if Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, the government is no longer a limited one possessing enumerated powers, but an indefinite one subject to particular exceptions. And here's the money shot. It is to be remarked that the phrase out of which this doctrine is elaborated is copied from the old Articles of Confederation, where it was always understood as nothing more than a general caption to the specified powers. TLDR, if you want to know how the founders understood the General Welfare Clause, you got to go back to the Articles of Confederation and then even further back as well. Now, with that just brief introduction, let's go through these 6 categories comparing and contrasting systems of federalism under the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution for the United States. And I think the first big difference is the foundational structure of Congress itself. And I'm not talking about the difference between a unicameral Congress and bicameral, 2 houses, House and Senate, 1 branch versus 2. Instead, it's about delegates to Congress versus representatives and senators. Here, from the beginning of the Articles of Confederation, they put things like, we, the undersigned delegates of the states, whereas the delegates of the United States of America assembled. So in the Confederation, they're representing states. There is no representation of the people themselves in Congress. There's a layer between them. They're representing the state legislatures. And near the end of the Articles of Confederation, they actually make this clear. Whereas it hath pleased the great governor of the world to incline the hearts of the legislatures we respectively represent in Congress to approve of and to authorize us to ratify the said Articles of Confederation and perpetual union. Well, perpetual until the people decide they want to make it not perpetual anymore. I guess for those of you who want to discuss secession, that's an interesting point that Brian McClanahan and others make. But they're representing the state legislatures. And here, the articles thereof shall be inviolably observed by the states we respectively represent. And that is much closer to really a league or alliance than what we think of as a union or a confederation or a republic today. Now, the Constitution was supposed to be a mixture, representing people proportionately in the House of Representatives and the states equally in the Senate. You see here in Section 2, Article 1, Section 2, the House of Representatives. Is that Article 1? Yeah, Article 1, Section 2. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members, not delegates from states, because delegates, of course, can be recalled. If you think about delegates to other treaty unions, for example, in more modern times, you may be able to pull back and swap out your delegate at any time. But if you're a member of the House of Representatives, you're chosen for a certain number of terms, and they are there pretty much, well, and as it plays out, no matter what. Patrick Henry specifically looked at things like the impeachment power, if we're talking about the executive branch, as a sham. In Section 3, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state. And how those delegates or representatives, how they're chosen, says quite a bit as well. Here in Article 5 of the Articles of Confederation, it points out that for the more convenient management of the general interests of the United States, delegates shall be annually appointed in such manner as the legislature of each state shall direct. There is nothing... I'm no fan of the United Nations, but when the United States sends an ambassador, basically a delegate, a representative or a delegate for the United States to the United Nations isn't telling the United States how they can be chosen. This is a very similar approach in the Articles of Confederation. It is up to each state. They may want to have a popular vote if they wanted to do that, if they wanted to be appointed by the governor, debates in their legislature. It doesn't matter. Maybe they pick the longest straw. It doesn't matter. It wouldn't matter. All that matters is that if the state wants them to be there, that is going to be their delegate in the United States in Congress assembled. So that's very important. And under the Constitution, even before the 17th Amendment, there were uniform rules, and there still are today, for how senators and members of the House were supposed to be chosen. So there is more of a national approach to how these representatives and senators are sent to Congress. Now, again, here in Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution, we're looking at our next thing, how the votes are counted in Congress. And that's a big change as well between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. In Article 1, Section 3, for example, each senator shall have 1 vote. So you have 50 states, 2 senators, or 57, depending on who's president, 2 senators from each state. So you have 100 votes in the Senate. Now, under various rules, there may be a majority vote required for something to pass, a 2/3 veto override, for example. And so on the Senate side, for example, we have 100 votes. But because the articles were purely a union of states, they had this in Article 5. In determining questions in the United States in Congress assembled, each state shall have 1 vote. So you couldn't find, let's say, like a state that had 1 voting for one issue and 1 voting for the other issue on the other side. You wouldn't get a split vote joining one team or the other. The states were represented, and there would be 1 vote per state. And they were 1 vote per state, and it didn't matter how many delegates were sent to Congress. There wasn't a specific equal number. No state shall be represented in Congress by less than 2, nor by more than 7 members. So they could send 7 members, and they can debate, and maybe they vote 4-3 on a particular issue, but that means the state itself gets 1 vote on the yes side. So this points to the fact that the delegates are representing states, more of a system of federalism than under the Constitution for the United States. Now, next up is the executive branch. Our third point here, our third difference. And here in Article 2, Section 1, they say the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. Now, of course, there's all kinds of debate about what executive power may be, and it's not super well defined for most people. And so therefore, this is one of these things that we're seeing as an ambiguous term. How much power would that be? Of course, we know how it's supposed to be, not how it's played out is a different story. But under the Articles of Confederation, there was no federal executive branch. They did have a president of the Congress, but this was basically just someone overseeing, kind of the guy running the meetings. This was not someone who had any executive power at all. There was no federal executive branch, no federal executive power. The only mention of the word executive, I think it comes up 3 times in the Articles of Confederation, is regarding state executives, governors, or state executive. For example, this. If any person guilty of or charged with treason, felony, or other high misdemeanor in any state shall flee from justice and be found in any of the United States, you notice how the United States wasn't one blob, like one nation? The United States. States is plural because the phrase the United States means there's more than one state. He shall, upon demand of the governor or executive power of the state from which he fled, be delivered up and removed to the state having jurisdiction of his offense. So even in this situation, it specifically spells out that no action is taken unless the governor or executive of the state demands it. So the power, the choice of whether or not to take action is still in the hands of the states. Number 4 on the list is the judiciary, the judicial branch. Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. So under the Constitution, there is an entire branch set up just for courts, just for judiciary. But under the Articles of Confederation, there was no judicial branch at all. There was no judiciary. They did have the power in Congress to appoint courts for just this very limited set of reasons. For the trial of piracies, this is in Article 9, trial of piracies and felonies committed on the high seas, and establishing courts for receiving and determining finally appeals in all cases of captures. So basically, is that basically admiralty? So this is not day-to-day courts where you have an individual suing Congress and trying to get the general government to do something or to stop doing something. That wouldn't happen at all under the Articles of Confederation. Now, instead of having a judicial branch for disputes between the states, they actually had a long and pretty complex process that was more like arbitration than anything. It involved agents of states actually appointing judges or commissioners to basically resolve these disputes as a last resort. And that's how they put it in the Articles of Confederation as well. The United States and Congress assembled shall also be the last resort on appeal in all disputes and differences now subsisting or that hereafter may arise between 2 or more states concerning boundary, jurisdiction, or any other cause, whatever. And as you can see just by that phrase, this is a pretty long part of the Articles of Confederation. I do urge you to read these documents in full. Of course, they'll be linked to in the show notes. But the disputes are supposed to be resolved by the parties first. And if they can't figure it out, if both sides aren't saying, okay, dude, we're cool with this, then they appeal to Congress, and then they have this arbitration process, how they choose who these commissioners are going to be. And if they can't agree on them, then they go through another step. It was pretty complex, and it didn't, I I don't know, this was not something that you saw people really argue for or against a lot during the ratification debates for the Constitution, but I think that's really interesting as well. And as I mentioned, of course, you definitely want to read these documents in full. I urge you to read them each at least once a year, just once in a while. Go through the full text. It can't take you too long to be able to do this. And if we set aside time to continue reading and knowing and learning, we're better than probably 99.9% of people who have served in Congress in our lifetime. And these will be linked to in the show notes, along with the documents from James Madison. I've got a couple of other episodes to refer you to as well. That'll be linked to in the show notes. We publish a blog post for those every episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Alan Mosley does a really awesome job getting those organized every single episode, and I get them published a couple of hours after the live stream is done. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. While I'm here, I want to take a quick moment to say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here, whether it's live or in the archive, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. Thank you so much. This is really important stuff, and I'm glad that there are some people out there who are interested in learning about these founding principles. There's Michael, PSI, Cheriton Farmer, Al, Haji, Melody, Self-Evident, Crew Chief. Good to see you. I haven't seen a live stream in a while, Crew Chief. Genevieve, Nick from Detroit, Rights Are Not Tradition, True Fuse, Speak Life, and a bunch of other people. I know I'm just kind of scrolling through this pretty quickly, and I missed a bunch of you, but I'm very grateful for you spending some of your time with me and showing some interest in learning about these essential principles. But let's get right back to it. The next one, and I think this is one of the biggest differences. This is one of the primary things that the Federalist side complained about. Of course, they wanted to have power to regulate commerce among the several states. That's not something that they had in the United States in Congress assembled. But one of the biggest things was the taxing power. The argument was basically on the Federalist side, well, without the power to compel taxation, we're going to be seen on the world stage as weak. And if we're weak, we're going to get run over by, well, maybe Britain will come back. They did. Maybe the French will come here or the Spanish. We are going to get destroyed. That was the fear-mongering that they used. Some people agreed, some people did not. But the difference was the system of taxation. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had zero taxing power. They couldn't tax whatever on the people at all. Instead, they had what's known as the requisition system. Basically, they would kind of tally up what each state was supposed to pay, and then it was up to each state to determine how they were going to do that. They may tax all their people. They may base it on landowners, property owners. They may do a sales tax. They could do whatever they wanted, as long as they kind of like how they could do whatever they wanted in how they chose their delegates to the United States in Congress assembled. Here from Article 8, all charges of war and all other expenses that shall be incurred for the common defense or general welfare and allowed by the United States in Congress assembled shall be defrayed out of a common treasury, which shall be supplied by the several states, in proportion to the value of all land within each state, granted to or surveyed for any person, as such land and the buildings and improvements thereon shall be estimated, according to such mode as the United States in Congress assembled shall from time to time direct and appoint. So then, basically, they're going to calculate how much is owed based on these principles. But then the taxes for paying that proportion shall be laid and levied by the authority and direction of the legislatures of the several states within the time agreed upon by the United States in Congress assembled. So here's your bill. It's due by this time. You figure out how to get it done. And this was a big debate. I'll get to that in a moment. The requisition versus the non-requisition system. Here, first of all, in the Constitution for the United States, even before the 16th Amendment, the Constitution did authorize a federal or general government taxing power. This is the General Welfare Clause. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. So they did have some taxing power under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, the General Welfare Clause. The United States and Congress assembled under the Articles of Confederation had zero taxing power. Now, even the anti-federalists who thought that they wanted to oppose the Constitution, many of them actually did not like the requisition system, but that didn't mean that they were necessarily on board with this approach. Now, Patrick Henry was one of the few, along with George Mason and a few others, that really went to bat for that requisition system. They thought it was basically the foundation of their political prosperity because the way Henry put it was, in essence, if they ask for too much, well, we're not going to give it to them. So it leaves the final say about how much money is taken or stolen by taxes and spent by the government then, or the general government, it leaves it in the hands of the states. Now, on the other hand, Alexander Hamilton would be very representative of the Federalist side, where he basically said, like, look, if we have to basically rely on them, beg them, they're never going to pay. And he, in Federalist number 16, he said, if the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, all they have to do is not act or act evasively, and the measure is defeated. Now, that is not just in regards to the taxing power, but that's in regards to anything. Now, he stumbled upon how we use things to defeat federal programs today by not acting or acting evasively on a state and local level, but he was complaining about that under the Articles of Confederation. I covered this tax system battle in an episode about a year and a half ago, April of 2023, for National Theft Day, Tax Day, Henry versus Hamilton on the requisition system. I think you'll find that one super interesting. It will be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And in this last one, we have one that's actually a similarity and a difference at the same time. Now, under both of these constitutions, because they were a constitution, the Articles of Confederation were as well, the general government was only authorized to exercise those powers which have been enumerated, delegated to it. Everything else was reserved. But how that reserved power was defined was actually different between the two. I'll read the text, and you let me know what you think. Here in Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. So if it's not expressly delegated, it's automatically retained to each state its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. All powers, jurisdictions, and rights not expressly delegated are reserved. Now, under the Constitution, the Federalists originally, specifically people like James Wilson, James Madison, Tench Cox, of course, Alexander Hamilton, but primarily we'll start with Wilson and Cox. They said, well, we don't need to include this because, well, the system is they're only authorized to exercise those powers delegated to this. And so they didn't actually include a similar statement originally in the Constitution for the United States. This was a massive sticking point for the debate between the anti-federalists and the federalists. And in fact, I think it's the number one reason. Well, the debate over it is the number one reason why we have the 9th and 10th Amendment, which I'll read to you in just a moment. But it is really the number one thing where they came together to agree upon. Because in Massachusetts in early 1788, when they were doing vote counting to see if Massachusetts was going to ratify the convention, it was clearly going to lose early on. So there was a deal made between Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Primarily, we can call them on the anti-federalist side. They were opposing ratification or staying kind of silent about it. Means they weren't on board. Until those guys got on board, there was no way they were going to win. And then on the Federalist side, you had people like Theophilus Parsons, a very powerful speaker, top legal mind. I believe Rufus King, and a few others, and they made a deal, and I think it was probably the amendment process was John Hancock's idea to say, let's ratify, but we're going to recommend a bunch of amendments. And the first thing that they recommended was very similar to the expressly delegated language in the Articles of Confederation. Patrick Henry in Virginia and George Mason and William Grayson and others on the anti-federalist side got something similar included in the ratification document for Virginia, recommended amendments, even though Patrick Henry wanted to attach them not just as recommendation, because he said, well, if we just recommend them, Well, they may make us a promise, but how can we trust that's actually going to happen? And anyone who trusts their liberties into the hands of people promising to do stuff is really in big trouble. But anyway, so we did end up under that debate. We ended up with the 9th and 10th Amendment together, not just the 10th on this. Amendment number 9, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And of course, the 10th Amendment, I should have this off the top of my head, but sometimes when I'm live, it doesn't happen too well. Let's try it. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor reserved by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Boom, I think I got it. So there's a difference in how it was, the language was used in this, expressly delegated. They did not include that language. Thomas Jefferson thought it was too narrow. Basically, the argument was if you include that in the document, then they can only do exactly what words say in the document. And well, that's going to cause us to run into a bunch of problems. And of course, there were examples given of how under the Articles of Confederation, some people think the Articles of Confederation was just a win. Well, they certainly created the first national bank prior to Alexander Hamilton's first bank under the Constitution. They created it, even though there was no express authorization to do so. So Jefferson warned, Madison warned, that if you create it too limited, recognizing what government does, well, government's just going to violate the rules anyways. And maybe that tells us a different underlying problem. Now, it's important to understand, even with these 6 categories, that as noted by James Madison at the beginning of this episode in Federalist number 40, that much of the Constitution was formed as an outgrowth of the Articles of Confederation. But if we think of the timing, the Articles came into effect in 1781, but the Articles were a product of the American Revolution, even before the War for Independence. For example, Benjamin Franklin actually made the first proposal for an Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union in July of 1775, shortly after the shot heard round the world, but a year before the Declaration of Independence. I covered this in some detail in an episode that I think you will enjoy. It talks about this precursor to the precursor of the Articles of Confederation, Benjamin Franklin's Articles of Confederation. Alan Mosley will get that link to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But the drafting of the Articles of Confederation that was in effect, I believe it was 1781 until early 1789, that came from the exact same resolution that gave us the Declaration of Independence, the Lee Resolution of 1776, something I also never learned about in government-run school. And here from the National Archives, they point out that on June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution, quote, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. This was acting under the instruction of, well, the Virginia Revolutionary Convention. The Lee Resolution contained 3 parts: a Declaration of Independence, a call to form foreign alliances, and a plan for confederation. So the Articles of Confederation were part of the American Revolution. So if we want to understand the Revolution, the precursor to the United States, really, we have to understand the Articles of Confederation and the whole process of how it came to be. On June 11, 1776, so 4 days later, Congress appointed, this is the Second Continental Congress, they appointed 3 concurrent committees in response to the Lee Resolution: one to draft a Declaration of Independence, a second to draw up a plan for forming alliances, foreign alliances, and a third to prepare and digest the form of a confederation. It took them a long time to get unanimous approval for that Articles of Confederation to go into effect, but they certainly started that process right at the beginning of independence. Now, I don't know about you, but I never learned really any of this in the government-run schools. I had to seek it out on my own, which is why this quote from Abigail Adams in a letter to her son, John Quincy, is really one of my favorites. And she said, "Learning is not attained by chance. It must be sought for with ardor and attended to with diligence. And this is a big reason why we work so hard every single day here at the 10th Amendment Center to reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles. And there is absolutely nothing that helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you want to help us do this work and get the word out to more people, you can pitch in for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, all spelled out. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. No one punches above their weight class better than the 10th Amendment Center, so I'd be very grateful for any amount of support you can give us. But if you're not able to contribute financially or you're just not interested, you can certainly help us out in a number of free and easy peasy ways. Of course, hitting that like button, subscribing, getting notifications, leaving comments, leaving reviews on whatever podcast platform you happen to be watching or listening on. Of course, we do even like on Spotify these days, we're doing video podcasts there as well. All those things can trigger the algorithms, especially of the mainstream platforms, and tell them to show us to more people. I'm very grateful for that. And I also want to take a quick moment to let you know how grateful I am for a handful of people who have joined us as members recently. I can't get through everybody, but I just picked a few people out at random. I'm incredibly grateful for your support. There's Carl in Oklahoma, Andrea in Mississippi, Robert in Ohio, John here in California, Christine in Florida, and Christopher in Connecticut. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members if you want to join them. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty is where we're going to have the blog post published with the reference links for this episode in a couple of hours. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope this was interesting. I hope you learned something. I hope it made you think. That's more important than anything. Hope you have an awesome day, and I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.